Even after investing another second-round pick in the position, the national perception isn't necessarily looking good for the Seahawks edge defenders. Is that perception reality? Nick Lee and I are going to be discussing on our latest Blue Friday installment of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week, as we do each and every Friday. Really excited to have Nick Lee joining me on the show as co-host, and we're drawing closer to the start of training camp. We're going to continue our Forecast Friday series, looking at Ken Walker III and Bobby Wagner, and last week, we looked at offensive position groups and ranked them. We're going to do defensive position groups this week. Should be a really fun episode. Glad to have all the 12s out there on board, tuning in and listening. Now for your lead story here on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. It's been a prevailing theme the last 4 or 5 years for the Seahawks, Nick, but this has been a team that ever since Frank Clark was traded to the Kansas City Chiefs, even with some of the big names that they have brought in, the edge rushing position has been viewed as a general weakness for this football team. And that perception doesn't look to be changing, even with Derick coming in as a second-round pick. The other second-round picks, Boye Mafe and Darrell Taylor on this roster. Uchenna Nwosu had a really solid first year in Seattle. And yet, here we are, the perception nationally looks to be pointing to the edge rushing group, the pass rushing unit, as one of the worst in the National Football League. And that includes Mike Clay from ESPN. Looking at his rankings, the Seahawks coming in at 27th out of 32 teams in the league. The Rams and the Cardinals are both behind him, so the NFC West is in trail mode here in this category. Nick, when you look at this perception, and it's not just Mike Clay, it's universal. It seems like the edge rushing group is the group that everybody's pointing to, actually more so than the interior defensive line. Mike Clay's got the edge rushing group as the weakest point on Seattle's entire roster, and he does not share that opinion solely. Do you think that this perception is reality, or is this a case where these edge rushers are much better than advertised, or at least have a chance to be much better than advertised?
Well, they certainly have a better chance to be advertised. And when you look at based on production last year, I mean, as a whole, I know that sacks are a bit of a tricky number, especially with edges, because they can come from linebackers, from interior defensive linemen, from secondary as well. But Seahawks were 9th overall in sacks last year. Uchenna Nwosu was 8th in quarterback hits last year, 13th in total pressures. So he had a really good year. But I think what the Seahawks do lack right now is that star power, that name recognizability. They don't have that perennial Pro Bowler, that guy that, like, oh, the Seahawks edge rusher, boom, this guy. They don't have that, and that's been for a while. So I think that kind of stigma has stuck a little bit with the Seahawks having that true, like you mentioned, since Frank Clark. They've lacked that true, really star, or at least emerging star at the edge position. So the production last year and what we expect this year certainly does not match that ranking. I think that's far too low. Now, do I think they're a top 10 unit? Absolutely not. Uchenna Nwosu, like I mentioned, was top 10 in a lot of categories among edges. The problem was that there was a large drop-off between him and Darrell Taylor as far as total pressures. I believe the next edge defender, Darrell Taylor was the next edge defender on the Seahawks, and he had 27 pressures compared to 62 for Uchenna Nwosu, so less than half. And I think it's just full of unknowns. And, you have Boye Mafe year 2. That's a big unknown. You have Derick, the impact he could make as a rookie, like you mentioned. That could really swing this in a positive direction. If Boye Mafe takes a step and Derick comes in and makes an impact as a rookie, this unit will be very solid. I think 27 is pretty darn low. I would probably err on the 15 to 20 range, maybe right around the middle of the pack right now. So 27, I think, is a bit harsh.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about the name recognition aspect. I mean, even Uchenna Nwosu outside of Seattle, even with the season he had last year, he's not a household name around the league. And until he gets double-digit sacks, he got very close last year to doing that. But until he becomes a double-digit sack guy and makes a Pro Bowl or is a second-team All-Pro selection, it's going to be difficult for him to enter that realm where he has a name that's recognized. And then the rest of the players, and Darrell Taylor's had flashes. He was brilliant rushing the passer the second half last year. He was as good as any pass rusher in the league, but he's been very inconsistent, and he hasn't been able to play enough snaps because his run defense has been severely lacking at times, and teams were purposely running at him last year. That was the big reason he lost his starting job after 3 games. It wasn't because he couldn't rush the passer. It was the run defense that was keeping him off the field and limited his snaps. Boye Mafe, on the other hand, he was a flip of that. He was outstanding against the run, which that was not expected. And pass rushing, he didn't get a lot of chances, but only 10 pressures, limited pressure rate. And then Derick Hall coming in the league. Rookies, you just don't know what you're going to get out of those players coming into the league. Boye Mafe was decent as a rookie last year. Darrell Taylor missed his entire first season. His pseudo-rookie year had 6.5 sacks. So you just don't know what you're going to get. But I think that's really been the theme this week because we've talked about Devin Witherspoon at corner and how he could impact an already good cornerback group, and Jackson Smith and Jigba at receiver. What are the realistic expectations? There's a lot of projection here when we're talking about these young players, and there's a very young stable of pass rushers here. So I could see them being in the 20s just based on the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty. If this was based off of upside strictly, though, I think Seattle, with all the second rounders, they've got the young talent. This is still a group that could be a top 15, maybe even top 10 caliber group if everything falls in line. They've got that kind of talent. But again, this is projections based. And when you're talking about projections, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. And it's possible that some of these young guys are going to hit a little bit of a wall, or maybe Derick Hall doesn't contribute as much as they hope as a rookie. The Seahawks are hoping that's not the case. But you also have Tyreke Smith, who's another big unknown coming into the season. You've just got a lot of young guys that you're not necessarily sure what you're going to get. And even Uchenna Nwosu, he's been an ascending player, but he's had 1 year with more than 5 sacks. So what does he do to follow up that breakout season last year? There's talent. There's guys that fit the scheme, but it's certainly a group that's got a lot of question marks too. And so I think that's a big reason why they're as low on that list for Mike Clay and as low as they are in the rankings for a lot of other media experts out there. I think that's the big reason why, is because there's not palpable evidence of consistent multi-year production from this group.
Yeah, and I just feel like rankings like 27th and on, or maybe 25th and down, that should be more reserved for known commodities that are terrible. The Seahawks are not a known commodity at the edge department, which I think could be to their benefit. Like we mentioned, no star power yet, a lot of young guys, a lot of unprovens, a lot of question marks, but that could be a good thing. And I think you and I both kind of believe it as a good thing because, yes, the track record since, in the post-Frank Clark era has not been great at the edge position. And I think this is starting to emerge as a new era for the Seahawks in this position. And, so that ranking is a bit more, I think, for like, oh, yeah, we know this team. We know who they are, and their edge rushers stink. That is not the Seahawks. That is not the ranking they deserve. That's the question marks, the rookies, the unsung heroes of the Uchenna Nwosu. That's, I feel like, a bit more towards like the late teens or early 20s kind of ranking.
Yeah, I look at this group and you look at the perception, and 27 out of 32 teams. There's plenty of other rankings out there where the edge position is viewed as a big question mark or in the lower third in the NFL. I think to change that perception, as silly as it is, you got to have at least one of these guys be a double-digit sack producer. I think that as silly as that is, that's the number. Those are the stats that matter. Can you get double-digit sacks? Can they have somebody, as Mina Kimes said in our show, can you have a player truly emerge as that number one pitcher? They haven't had that go-to strikeout guy coming off the edge since Frank Clark left. They just haven't. They've had some decent players. They've had some really good number twos, but can they have somebody step up as that number one, that ace rushing off the edge, whether that's Nwosu or Taylor or Derick Hall comes in as a stud immediately as a rookie? That'd be huge for the Seahawks. I think that's how you change the perception, though, is you got to have somebody that truly rises to stardom. And Nwosu might be close. Some of these other guys might be close. But until somebody actually reaches that point, it's going to be difficult to change that national perception from several years of average and mediocre production rushing quarterbacks.
Sorry, a dog barking out in there. So it's much like a lot of this team. We saw it last year, some unsung, some under the radar. I think this is how this team thrives. In fact, I'm glad that they are ranked so low. I'm happy because I would rather it that way than, being overrated. I would rather they be underrated. So I'm hoping, even though this is kind of a silly thing, just another notch in the, chip on the shoulder belt.
Coming up next, we're going to continue our Forecast Friday series. We're going to have Ken Walker III and Bobby Wagner as our offensive and defensive spotlighted players. We'll look at what went right, what went wrong for those two players in 2022, and projections for the upcoming season. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks that is brought your way by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right, just $20 bet, and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to over-under who you think is going to hit the first home run of the day. It's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet an MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined on today's show by my co-host, Nick Lee. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Whether you're listening in Anchorage, Alaska, or down in Dallas, Texas, and Cowboys country, we greatly appreciate you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. For our everydayers out there, coming up on Monday, we're going to continue our training camp preview series. We're going to be shifting back over to the defensive side of the football. We're going to be talking defensive tackles, the meat of the defensive line. Let's get to our Forecast Friday now, shall we? We've got Ken Walker III and Bobby Wagner, two players, different ends of the spectrum. Ken Walker III coming off an amazing rookie year. Bobby Wagner, 33 now, still playing at a very high level, now entering his 12th season. We'll start with K9 on offense, Nick. And you look at what he did last year, the second running back in Seahawks history to have over 1,000 rushing yards in his rookie campaign, finished second in Rookie of the Year voting, nearly hit double-digit touchdowns. And he did that when he became a starter in week 5. It's not like he was the starter at the beginning of the season, put up really good numbers. Overall, a highly impressive season. It feels like he's just scratching the surface of his potential, even with Zach Charbonnet now coming in to push for some of his playing time, for some of his snaps.
Man, if he would have been able to log a couple more starts there earlier in the year, I think he runs away with the Offensive Rookie of the Year. In fact, I still think he should have won it. Garrett Wilson had a fine season, but if he's playing in Tampa or Tennessee or Arizona, he doesn't win that award. He won because he won in New York, and he won it over Walker because of that. Walker had 9 rushing touchdowns, over 1,000 yards. He actually had, I kind of dove into the voting, and Ken Walker had more first place votes than Garrett Wilson. And maybe if he reaches that 1,100 yard, 10 touchdown plateau, he wins. But either way, fine season for a rookie running back. Absolutely, the Seahawks just know how to find those guys. And the head scratching that went on when the Seahawks selected him so high, in early in the second round, that went away pretty quickly when he took the field and started racking up carries. And his 4.6 yards per carry last year was actually better than parts of peak Marshawn Lynch in Seattle, better than Marshawn Lynch's 2011 and 2013 campaigns as far as yards per carry go. So really, really solid there. And it's just, you love that he established himself there now as the alpha in the room as far as running backs go, because now you bring in, like you mentioned, another young gun in Zach Charbonnet, who it should garner some carries. And last year when Rashad Penny went down, it was the Ken Walker show starring himself, Ken Walker. I mean, that was it pretty much. I mean, DJ Dallas, mixed in there. But now that's very much not the case. And that's I think a really good thing for the Seahawks as a team. But as far as, the mouths to feed kind of thing, where, how many carries can Ken Walker get? Can he get to the 225, 230 range again? or 250 if he plays the whole season. With guys like Zach Charbonnet, who I think will push for 100 carries, or Kenny McIntosh. I think we need to start. You and I both have talked about him a lot. I think he's still a little bit under talked about as a 7th round pick. But the real question, I think, right now, Corbin, besides, of course, staying healthy, because, boy, that has just been an issue for Seattle running backs in recent past. But just with the quality of talent that they've added on the draft with Ken Walker, will he have that opportunity to be that alpha, bell cow this season?
Yeah, that's really the big question. And I've talked a little bit about it on earlier episodes. I still think that he's going to be their workhorse, but you might see a little bit smaller percentage share so you can get Zach Charbonnet and some of these other backs onto the field. But I also expect that this offense is going to be better on 3rd down. They're going to be able to prolong drives a little bit more so they can get more opportunities for their running backs too. But when you look at what Walker did last season, there's a lot of stuff that jumps out. For one, according to PFF, he was tied for 3rd for the most designed run plays of 15-plus yards. He was Captain Explosive. Maybe not quite as much as Rashad Penny in terms of percentage, but he still hit a bunch of home runs. He's a guy that can take the top off of defense. He can blow by linebackers, corners, and safeties. He was in the top 10 in missed tackles forced. He was in the top 10 in rushing yards for the season. He was in the top 10 in, I think I already said missed tackles forced, but he was in the top 10 as well in yards after contact from week 5 on. So we're talking about a guy that really had an impressive season for the Seahawks, top 10 in rushing touchdowns, even though he didn't start a game until week 5. So you can just keep looking at the numbers that he put up, and it was really a phenomenal season. Maybe the number I like the most, he didn't fumble once the entire season, and that was something he was known for at Michigan State and Wake Forest. He didn't put the ball on the ground, really good with ball security. I think the one thing that we have to see really improve this year, that 4.6 yards per carry number is a fine number, but I feel like it could go up significantly if he was less of a feast or famine runner. And what I mean by that is I felt like, especially when they had that slump where they were struggling, the O-line had some to do with this, but he was too patient. He was trying to be too much like a Le'Veon Bell type, and that indecisiveness was leading to too many plays at the line of scrimmage or in the backfield. It was setting him behind the sticks. It was lowering his yards per carry average. And there were a number of games where he was below 3 yards per carry during that stretch. And some of that was on him. He's got to be more decisive. The windows, the creases to run through, they're pretty small in terms of the amount of time that you have to be able to get downhill against NFL defenses. So that and pass protection, that is still an area where he's really got to shore things up. Giving up 7 pressures on less than 50 pass protection snaps, that's not necessarily what you're looking for there. So he's got to continue to make strides there. But if he can do that, I still think he's a 1,000-yard rusher as long as he can stay healthy. Maybe touchdowns are impact a little bit with Charbonnet, but I expect that he's going to be able to contribute some in the passing game. And I certainly think that this is a player that has a chance to really build off last year and be one of the better running backs in the NFC.
You bring up a really good point about the yards per carry thing, kind of being maybe a little bit misleading because, yeah, I was looking at his game logs and he had 1, 2, 3, full games of yards per carry above 4.6 when he started. He also had 3 games, when he started, three full workloads of games where he was below 3 yards per carry. So that there definitely was a wide disparity there for sure, like you mentioned in the past game, third downs. That's something to be improved. And I could see, especially as we have that 17th game now, it's a little easier to get to the 1,000-yard mark. Really, if he stays healthy most of the year, I think he's going to get to the 1,000-yard mark pretty easily. I do think that he'll see his carries dip a little bit as far as per game, maybe with some of the added talent around him. But like we keep having to remind ourselves, he wasn't a starter until pretty much October. So if he gets that full season with how quality of a runner, how explosive he was, I think he'll get to 1,000 yards pretty easily, health willing.
Let's shift over to the defense to a first ballot Hall of Famer now coming back to Seattle, Bobby Wagner, after a 1-year stint in LA. He's no longer going to be wearing those ugly blue and yellow uniforms that Seahawk fans love to hate. He's going to be back in blue and green, going to get to wear the retro uniforms at some point this season. I mean, Seahawk fans were rejoicing, as they should be, that Bobby Wagner was back in town, and for good reason, because this is not just a ceremonial signing. This isn't like you're just bringing back an aging player that isn't what he used to. I mean, maybe he isn't the player he was 3 or 4 years ago, but Bobby Wagner's still pretty darn good. Second team All-Pro, surpassed 100 tackles for the 11th consecutive season. Talk about consistent excellence. Career high in sacks. He had 6 of them, 20 quarterback pressures, had just 1 touchdown allowed in coverage, intercepted 2 passes. I mean, you could nitpick a little bit with some of the coverage numbers out there, 11 yards per reception allowed. But, I mean, Nick, he only gave up 1 touchdown. He had 3 pass breakups. He had the 2 interceptions, the sacks, the pressure numbers. I mean, Bobby Wagner might have to do things a little bit differently than he did a few years back, but he's still an incredibly disruptive runner, or disruptive linebacker, and still a very disruptive player against the run, which, seeing the way the Seahawks played last year, they could certainly use that back in the middle of their defense.
Yeah, he's certainly not the same exact player he was, in, say, the 2015, 2019 range for the Seahawks, but that doesn't always have to be a bad thing. I think he's a different kind of really, really good linebacker. He's added a little bit to the, add a little bit of tricks to the trade. And I just chuckled looking at his, Pro Football Reference page, or, his back of his football card, where it's going to be Seattle, 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 Los Angeles, Seattle, Seattle. That's going to be a weird part of his legacy, but that's okay. And another thing of last year was one of his better seasons of his entire career as far as not missing tackles. He only missed 2 tackles in over 1,000 defensive snaps last year. He was the highest graded linebacker by Pro Football Focus, which is incredible at 32 years old. Second highest run defender, highest graded tackler. Naturally, he's going to fix some issues on there with run defense for the Seahawks. I'm really excited to see him in the middle of that linebacker core in that defense again, because boy, the Seahawks could certainly need that help in the run defense. And yeah, like you mentioned, yeah, he is showing a little bit of decline in coverage, but big deal. He's an off-ball inside linebacker. That is not his bread and butter, never was, and that doesn't have to be. It's okay. And honestly, now looking at the Jordan Brooks injury, some of the guys they've brought in, thank God for Bobby Wagner, because this linebacker group, at least to start the season, would be in shambles if it wasn't for Bobby Wagner kind of being the anchor once again, like he has been for over a decade in Seattle. So I expect him to come back and kind of steady the ship there. And am I expecting first team All-Pro, 180 tackles? Probably not, but I'm expecting a good old fashioned Bobby Wagner season. Maybe Pro Bowl, maybe. Just out of that respect, but certainly he's not lost enough steps to lose being part of the conversation for one of the best linebackers in football currently, even at 33 years old. Last year, he clearly showed it with that monstrous chip on his shoulder he played with.
Yeah, you're looking at a case of an old dog learning new tricks, and that makes me really curious how the Seahawks are going to mesh him into their defense now, because they are going to do some things. And Wagner talked about this in a press conference recently, that they are going to mix some of the things the Rams did with him into what the Seahawks are now doing defensively. And the scheme that they adopted last year, that scheme had a lot of similarities to what the Rams were doing. So I don't think it's going to be a super tricky thing for them to get Bobby Wagner brought back and immersed into this defense with maybe a little bit different playing style. That may mean more opportunities where he's playing close to the line of scrimmage, and maybe a few more opportunities for him to blitz. He's very good at it, 6 sacks last year, and finding ways to mitigate maybe some of the deficiencies in coverage now. And I'm curious to see, I expect that based on him getting the green dot in his helmet again, I'm suspecting he's going to be on the field all the time. When they first re-signed him, I thought maybe they'll start weaning him back a little bit. But no, I expect at least beginning of the year, he is going to be out there full time. So there will be some schematic adjustments they will have to make to mitigate the fact he's not quite as fleet of foot as what he was earlier in his career, not going to be able to cover as much ground. But I think that they can do that. And I also think when they're in their nickel sets and even dime sets, you get Julian Love or Jamal Adams down there in the box, and you can help mitigate some of those coverage issues, giving Bobby Wagner a smaller window to handle coverage-wise. And I still think he can be effective in those instances. We saw that with the pass breakups and the interceptions last season. So Maybe the numbers aren't quite as good as we've seen from him in the past, Nick, but I mean, I would expect, based on his track record, you got to guarantee 100-plus tackles, and I would expect he can get his hands on at least one interception. I would think the Seahawks will find a way to get him after the quarterback a few times. I'm not expecting a replication of 6 sacks again, but I could see a couple of sacks this season. If they're able to get those kind of numbers from Bobby Wagner with the leadership he brings, this is going to be a huge addition to their defense that really struggled against the run last year.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest takeaway for me is just the infusion of veteran leadership and the ability against the run. I think that what the Seahawks are building a bit more of a balanced defense now. And yeah, it's when we were first talking about perhaps the Seahawks bringing Bobby Wagner back, I did kind of question like where the Seahawks were at in their development, in their defensive scheme. And, is it not that they would have outgrown Bobby Wagner, but have they moved on? But yeah, it sounds like there might be a bit of more of a melding pot of concepts there for Bobby Wagner. And really, he's going to be the most veteran, accomplished player on the field on the roster. So I think it's a really big signing, especially like I mentioned with Brooks's injury. He'll be along slowly because then otherwise you'd be dealing with, John Radigan, Devin Bush, who I'm still kind of have my one raised eyebrow at, and Vi Jones, who I think could be capable linebackers, but certainly not at the level of Bobby Wagner.
Yeah, you'd have a lot of uncertainty, and we know we already talked about a couple other positions where they've got some uncertainty, and that's really a perfect segue now heading into our third segment here on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined as always on Friday by my co-host, Nick Lee, and a special thanks to all the 12s for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Let's get to our defensive position rankings. We did offense last week. You and I were in agreement on receiver and running back at the top, and then we had some discrepancies after that. Let's go to the defensive side of the football, and I'm going to give you the mic here first, Nick, and I'm sure I know which one of two positions is going to be at number one in your list, but that's really where the debate starts.
Well, you and Rob touched on it yesterday. That this secondary is going to be, it's clearly the strongest point of this defense and maybe the strongest point of this team. And I'm going to have safeties at number one, and strictly because of the veteran, accomplishments, the Pro Bowls, especially. It comes down to this: if Jamal Adams is healthy and back to 2020 form, given Quandre Diggs playing at a high level, then the acquisition I'm considering in this position. Julian Love as a safety. If Jamal Adams is back to that form, you're talking about the best trio of safeties in the NFL, straight up. I mean, they do have that. I mean, you can talk about, this safety's better than this guy or whatever, but as far as the trio as a whole, I'll take the Seahawks trio over any other trio. That is a big caveat with Jamal Adams' health, and not only health, but is he back to that same Jamal Adams that the Seahawks traded for? So that's why I got safeties number one, just because of the Pro Bowls, the accolades, the veteran, accomplishments, and then Jamal Adams, the dynamic abilities of him. And then second, I have corners. And we all like Tariq Woolen. I think you and Rob brought up a fair point yesterday that wondering, can Tariq Woolen duplicate that same success he had as a rookie in year two that is historically can be pretty tough. I mean, even if he doesn't fully get there, being one of the leaders in interceptions, that even if he doesn't totally get there, the addition of Devin Witherspoon, you got Mike Jackson there, Trey Brown, I think that's a very, very solid group. It might not have the same, quote, star power as the safeties do, but I think they're pretty darn deep. And just the reason why I had corners under safeties is because of the youth and the Devin Witherspoon. Yes, top 5 pick, dynamic player, but he's a rookie, and we're in July. So we have not seen Devin Witherspoon take snaps in the Seahawks uniform when it means the most, or when the bullets start flying, so to speak. And until then, I'm not going to be skeptical, because I do believe in what Witherspoon can do. But just where he fits in this defense, how he plays when he finally gets his feet wet, there's a bit more question marks at corner than there are at safety as far as depth and we kind of know what you're going to get with the safeties as long as Jamal Adams comes back fully healthy. But that's really the line for me was pretty thin between corner and safety. I put safety at 1, corner at 2.
Yeah, this really did feel like it was one of those 1A, 1B type situations, but I'm thinking a little bit different than you. I've got the cornerback room coming in at number one and safety number two, but it is a very thin margin. And it really goes back to, you were just talking about the concerns. We haven't seen Devin Witherspoon play, and that's something we talked about yesterday. Until he's on the field playing actual games, we don't know what Devin Witherspoon is going to do for this team. But we also don't know what Jamal Adams is going to look like. That's a very similar situation. What is he going to look like coming off this severe torn quad tendon injury? Now, everything I've been told, it sounds like he has made a really good recovery. He's moving well. That's excellent news. But until I see number 33 out there and he is playing at the level that he was before his injury, or at least close to it, I can't put safety in front of corner when I know I'm going to have Tariq Woolen. I know he had his knee surgery, but he's going to be fine. He's going to be back for training camp. He's going to be good to go. I am confident Devin Witherspoon can play at a high level right away in the NFL. And if not, Mike Jackson had a really solid year. Trey Brown, Kobe Bryant. I just look at the players. They might not have the star power right now, but that group has the chance to have an incredible amount of star power. Another year or two from now, Devin Witherspoon and Tariq Woolen, that could be the equivalent of what it was like when Richard Sherman, Earl Thomas, and Cam Chancellor were roaming around at just the cornerback position. There's that kind of potential and upside. So I think, again, there's projecting here, but we don't know that Jamal Adams is going to get back. I still love the safety group, even if he's not quite right at the beginning of the season, because Julian Love has started a lot of games. And Quandre Diggs was one of the best safeties in football the last 7 or 8 games last year. He returned to form. I'm expecting him to pick up where he left off and once again be one of the true ball hawks in the NFL, that free safety position. Both these positions are strong. That's why the secondary could be potentially a special group this year for the Seahawks. As far as moving down the list, though, here's where you and I have a few more discrepancies on our list. After corner and safety, I've got linebacker at number 3, defensive end and edge coming in at number 4, and defensive line coming in the rear. That is one area that you and I agree. I think that's the only spot where we have the same teams. Looking at your list, defensive line, that is the same position unit at number 5, but you have edge ahead of linebacker. So I'm curious to hear your rationale on that, and then I'll get a chance to share my thoughts on that as well.
Well, we kind of touched on it a little bit in the first segment. I just really trust the depth at the edge position more than I do at linebacker. Of course, Bobby Wagner is a big piece in that. If it was just your top edge guy and top linebacker, I would have had him flipped, obviously. But I'm thinking more of depth and depth charts, in who's going to be on the field. And I think I trust the group of Uchenna Nwosu, Darrell Taylor, Draymond Jones, Derick Hall, those guys. Or Boye Mafe too, over the company that follows Bobby Wagner as far as Jordan Brooks' health. And then Devin Bush, John Radigan. If you take out Bobby Wagner, and I'm just kind of running under the assumption that Jordan Brooks is gonna take a little bit of time to get back fully what he was before this year. So you take out a fully healthy Jordan Brooks and then take out Bobby Wagner, and that linebacker room is a little tenuous. And when you take, I just like the depth a little bit more at edge. Like we mentioned, there's not that star power at the edge position, but I do like the depth where, Nwosu goes down. It's not, I don't think we're panicking. Like, I think if Bobby Wagner went down along with Jordan Brooks still trying to get back, I think I might panic a little bit. So it just comes down to me trusting the depth a bit more at edge.
Yeah, this one was actually very similar in the sense I mentioned 1A and 1B with the corners and safeties. This kind of felt like a 2A, 2B type thing where there was a pretty thin margin for error for me. And I think the edge group has more upside, but you have a rookie in Derick Hall, just like Devin Witherspoon. We're not sure what we're going to see there. And I have some questions in terms of, I think he's pro ready, but there's some things that I think are going to take some time with him. Whereas I think Devin Witherspoon's going to be able to jump right in and play, and he's going to have his rookie lumps, but I think he's going to be good right out of the gate. Hall's a player I got to see a little bit more before I really make a judgment on that. But Boye Mafe, are we going to see him really emerge as a pass rusher? Darrell Taylor, is he going to defend the run at all? Those are question marks to me. And I know one thing. I know number 54 is going to come downhill, and he's going to make plays against the run. And I know Bobby Wagner is going to contribute some. And I'm also going to say this. Maybe this is cheating, but I considered Jamal Adams to be part safety, part linebacker when I was doing this rating. because he's going to play in the box. And when they're in nickel and dime sets, he's going to be playing up there. So if I've got Bobby Wagner and Jamal Adams in the middle of my defense, both healthy, I really like that group. If I've got Jordan Brooks coming back, and I think he'll be ready to go early in the season, I get Jordan Brooks back. If not, I'm a little higher on Devin Bush at this point than what you are because he's 24. He's still a really young guy that it sounds like things just weren't working in Pittsburgh anymore. So he could be a classic change of scenery guy that rediscovers some of his game. I don't expect him to be the guy he was as a rookie, but I could see him being a factor on defense, a positive contributor. So I just look at that group with Jamal Adams clustered in there, and there's still the uncertainty about him coming back. But all these position groups in the bottom three, there are some question marks. I just feel like Bobby Wagner is that one true stable superstar that I expect is going to go out and he's going to make plays. And I think Devin Bush and Jordan Brooks, when he's healthy, can be competent starting linebackers for you. So I have a little more confidence there in terms of what I'm going to see. I could see more upside from the edge rushing group, though, if everything comes together. The one thing that we can agree on, the defensive line in the interior is still the biggest question mark. There's no question about it.
Yeah, and it's kind of a weirdly similar situation to the interior offensive line for the Seahawks, where they came in last in our rankings, and there's just some question marks. But I think we at least for me, like with the interior offensive line, the floor might be raised a little bit with some of the talent they added, and Jaron Reed certainly has his concerns. Brian Monet's the health, but Cameron Young I could see being a nice player. Miles Adams, Mike Morris, and don't count out Jonah Tavai either in the interior. So that is probably the biggest question mark, not only on the defensive side, maybe on the whole team, is how this interior defensive line will hold up and gel together. So I do think that they probably can be, when 2023, the season is over, I'm confident in saying there was an improvement there from 2022, but how the floor is a little low for that, so we'll see. But yeah, it's the whole defense I think has improved as a whole. Rising tide raises all ships, but that interior line still might be problematic depending on where the depth's at.
It really, to me, rides on, do you get a healthy Brian Monet back anytime soon? Because that is a polar opposite from Jamal Adams. The things that I've heard and things that Pete Carroll said about him, it's kind of like with Allen Robinson, who we didn't mention with the edge rushers. I just feel like those two guys, the report was pretty ominous on those guys. It seems like they are a long way away from being able to get back on the field. But if you could get Brian Monet back fairly early so that you have that big, massive nose tackle in the middle to go with Cameron Young, I think that would help a lot. Are you going to get the investment, the return on investment from Draymond Jones that you're hoping for? I see it on film, but is it going to work with this defensive scheme, with the different players he's got around him? Is Jaron Reed going to be able to find the fountain of youth a little bit this season and be a little bit more consistent with his play? He was just very up and down last year. Can Miles Adams take on a bigger role and be effective? I liked what I saw from him late last year, but he hasn't had a big role in the NFL where he's played significant snaps for more than a couple games. So you've got a number of question marks there. You're putting a lot of stock in your young guys. Mike Morris might have to play a lot more snaps than you'd expect from a fifth rounder, and I like the potential, but is he ready to do that? So again, I keep rattling off all these questions, and that is why, as you said, the floor might be a little bit higher than what last year's was, but we don't know where that ceiling is at with this group because there's so much uncertainty. And I still think there's going to be a veteran coming in. I don't know if it's Shelby Harris coming back. I don't know if there's another player out there they're going to kick the tires on and bring in, but I still expect that there's going to be somebody else added, probably at that nose tackle position, to try to give them a little bit more depth, especially with it not looking optimistic that Brian Monet is going to be able to make it back early in the 2023 season. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Nick at NickLee51. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back on Monday, we're going to continue our training camp preview. We're going to go back to that interior defensive line, plus our 90-man countdown going into the 20s. We'll have numbers 20 through 18. Going to be doing 3 players at a time now that we're doing some of the bigger name stars. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy your weekend, and thanks for listening. Go Hawks.